streaming. Start recording. Good morning. We begin by thanking our sponsors. We thank Bracha Strimber for sponsoring all the shurim for the month of Shvat in memory of Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi. Shama should have an Aliyah and the family should have an Achama. As well, we thank Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for sponsoring all the shurim this month in the schos for Refuah Shlema, for Shlamis Bas Sasha, she said Refuah Shlema B'soch, Sha'ar Choli Yisrael. Today's daf is daf Tes, daf Ches, the Maseches Nazir. We are going to pick up right at the top of daf Ches. There is a Mishnah. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Mishnah was already addressed in yesterday's daf, but we'll begin with the beginning half of the Mishnah, and then we're going to analyze most of the second half of the Mishnah today. So the Mishnah begins. Hareini Nazir kisa'ar roishi ka'afar ha'aretz u'kachol hayam. He says he's going to be a Nazir like the amount of hair that he has on his head. So unless he's pretty bald, he's going to have a lot of hair on his head. Or u'ka'afar ha'aretz, like the dirt of the aretz, u'kachol hayam, like the sand of the sea. So these are really just examples of infinite amounts of infinite numbers. We're talking about something which is not countable. It's innumerable. You can't count how many hairs you have on your head. You can't count the sand at the sea. You can't count the afar aretz. It's just not reasonable to count these things. And therefore, what the Mishnah says is, Harezat Nazir Olam. He is a Nazir Olam. Megaleach achas l'shoshim yom. He takes a haircut once every 30 days. Rabbi Omer ein zeh megaleach achas l'shloshim yom. So we have machlokus in our Mishnah. If a person says he's going to be a Nazir, and he compares his Nazirs to some infinite amount of Nazirs, so it's certain that he's going to be a Nazir for a very long time, because he used a very, very high number. The question just is, what type of long time is that going to be? And according to the Tanna Kama, he is a Nazir Olam, but he can take a haircut every 30 days. According to Rabbi, in other words, just to explain the first shita is he becomes a Nazir Olam, but each one is a period of Nazirs for 30 days. So basically, he is infinitely going to be a Nazir for 30 days. He has one period, then another period, and another period, and then another period. The Rosh actually explains this. The Rosh actually has a suffix over here. The Rosh at the beginning. So again, I'm going to go off into the Rosh over here, Maseches Nazir. The Rosh often offers a little bit more of what I have found to be an easier shot than the Mefarish, than Rashi over here. As well, Tosfos also sometimes does a little bit more, at least in my understanding, a little bit of an easier way to understand the Gemara. So the Rosh explains that Pirush, the third line, Hared Nazir, Megaleach Achas L'Shloshim Yom, Hikiba Olav Naziros, Keminyan Sa'ar Rosho, V'chol Lamed, V'lamed, Hevi Nazir B'fnei Atzmo. So says the Rosh, he's going to be a Nazir every 30 days again. So according to the first opinion of the Mishnah, he's a Nazir basically forever, but that forever Naziros that he's in is just a cycle of 30-day cycles, periods of Naziros. Now the Rosh actually, he explains as well that on the same day that he takes a haircut and brings his karbanos, that same day he actually starts his new Naziris again. Now the Rosh has a suffix, can he push that off? In other words, can he push off bringing the karbanos? When we know that there's an Isser of Bal Ta'achar, a person can't push off bringing karbanos more than Shalosh Regalim, but that's a lot of time. It's a whole year. So what if he pushes off the Naziris, pushes off bringing the karbanos? So he finishes his Naziris, and then he pushes it off for a couple days. Now technically a regular Nazir is allowed to do that. He becomes a Nazir, and then he says, you know what, I'll remain a Nazir, and I'll push it off a little bit. Can he do that? The Rosh seems to say that you can't do it, because part of your Kabbalah to be a Nazir is to be a Nazir again and again and again and again. So in as much as you're extending your first Nazirus and making that one longer, that in turn means that you're postponing starting your second Nazirus. So therefore the Rosh says he can't do that. Now Rabbi says, this is not a case where the Nazir is allowed to take a haircut once every 30 days. In other words, he just remains a Nazir forever, and he can't take a haircut. Now, what would be a case of a Nazir who can take a haircut every 30 days? The Ezu Megaleach Achas L'Shloshim, who is the person who can take a haircut once every 30 days? So that is Ha'omer Harei Alai Naziros Kisar Roshi Ukafar Aras Kuchalayam. When he clearly says Naziros, so there's clearly within his language, there's going to be a language of plural Naziros. In other words, he has multiple Naziros built into his language by saying Harei Alai Naziros, a number of different Naziros, each one being a regular period of Naziros to be said as 30 days. How many of those? An infinite number, like the amount of sand that covers the earth. It's not the repetition of the ratio. In other words, the first case is Hareini Nazir. I am a Nazir, which is singular. In that case, Rebbe disagrees and says a singular language of Nazir with an infinite number is going to be a Nazir forever. If he says Harei Naziros, plural Naziros, how many Naziros? That's where Rebbe would agree that he has 30 day, an infinite number of 30-day Naziros. And what's the difference between an infinite number of 30-day Naziros or an infinite amount of Naziros? Whether or not you can take a haircut every 30 days. The Mishnah continues. Hareini Nazir kimaloy albayis kim malo akupa. I am a Nazir like the whole house or like a full box. So a full house or a full box. Now again, I guess people use all kinds of language, and we have to know the halacha if a person speaks like this. What compelled the guy to become a Nazir like a full house? What compelled him to say like a full box? I don't know. But now we don't know what the house is full of or what the box is full of or how big the house is. So again, it's an ambiguous term. So the halacha is, says the Mishnah, Bodkino, so you check him out. Im Amar Achas Gedola Nazarti. In other words, it's just one big Naziris, then it's Nazir Lamed Yom. In other words, if he specifies what I meant was just one long Naziros, so then that's just basically, like we said previously, he's just talking about this feels like a very long time, that's going to be a 30-day Naziris. The Imamar, Stam Nazarti, I don't know, I just became a Nazir. Stam, I'm not sure. If you look at the Rush, it's hard to find it in the Rush because there's a lot of words here. But he says, Imamar Stam Nazarti, Lohaya Belibi Elama Sheyadonu Chachamim Lashoni. I don't know. I'm a person who just listens to the rabbi, and I'm not sure what I meant. I don't know what the halach is. I just said I'm going to be a Nazir like a full box. When he goes to the rabbi and says, what's the halacha if I become a Nazir like a full box? He does not know what he meant. Then the halacha is, Roin Esakupa Ki'ilu Himalaya Chardal. We look at the box as if it's filled up with mustard seeds, which obviously are very, very tiny, and therefore it's going to be a tremendous amount of Naziris there. The Nazir, Kol Yimei Chayav, he remains a Nazir for the rest of his life. The Gemara is going to ask, why do we jump to such an assumption that he's talking about a box filled with mustard seeds? Maybe he was talking about a box filled with watermelons. Why should it be mustard seeds? So we'll get to that in the Gemara. The Mishnah continues. Hareini Nazir Mikan V'ad Makom Ploni. So again, we mentioned this case before. I'm going to become a Nazir from here until it takes to get to a certain place. So Amdim, Kama Yama Mikan Ad Makom Ploni. How long does it take to get to the following place? In Pachos Milaman Yom. If it takes less than 30 days to get to that place, then Nazir Laman Yom. He's a Nazir for 30 days, like we said. Person can't be Kabbalah Naziris for less than 30 days. So therefore, if he's going to become a Nazir from here till a certain place, and it only takes 15 days to get there, he remains a Nazir for 30 days. If it takes longer than 30 days, Nazir, Kaminin Hayamim, he becomes a Nazir for exactly the amount of days that it takes to get to that location that he specified. Mishnah continues, Hareini Nazir Kaminyan Yemos Hachama. I am becoming a Nazir like the amount of days in a solar calendar. So for 365 days. Halacha is, Mona Naziris Kaminyan Yemos Hachama. He counts the Naziris like a solar calendar. which is 365 days. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Mai Sahaya, and Kivan Shlishameh. So now it's not really 365 days. And we're going to explain why. Because it basically is like we said earlier, he's becoming Naziros, a number of different Naziros for 365 days. So he has 365 30-day periods. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 30-something years, 30 years and a little bit. Right, 365 periods of Nazirs for 30 days. So basically for the next 30 plus years, he's going to be a Nazir. Now, the Rabbi Yehuda says Tosfos, he's just trying to bring a raya to this, and we're going to see it becomes relevant in the next half of the Yamud, that Rabbi Yehuda brings a raya to this and says, Maisa Haya, there was a story that happened in Kimmich Hishlim, when he finished his period of Nazirus, he died. You can understand why that might be the case. I don't know how old he was when he made Nazirus, but he added on an extensive period of Nazirus for 30 days. So imagine the guy was 80 years old. So he had a 30-year Nazirus, he was 120, and he died. So that is the Mishnah. Now the Gemara says, Rowan es kupa ki'ilu malaya chardol v'nazir kol yamav. You look at the box as if it's filled with mustard seeds. The Nazir kol yamav, he remains a Nazir his whole life. Gemara asks a simple question. We mentioned this in the Mishnah. V'yamai, why do we have to assume that this box is filled with mustard seeds? Why don't we look at this box like it's filled with cucumbers, or gourd, or melons? Why do we have to assume the worst? This guy's going to be a Nazir infinitely. Why can't we just assume? Maybe you could fit 5 cucumbers in here, 10 cucumbers in here, or maybe even 15 cucumbers, but at least it's a reasonable number. Why do we have to say that there's 5 billion mustard seeds inside the box? The Gemara says, and he'll have a solution to his problem. The Gemara says, indeed, this is something that depends on a machlokes in another place, which is Reb Shimoni. It goes according to Reb Shimon. The Amar, for he said, Adam machnes es atzmo ledavar shesfeko chamor mivada. A person can say something, leaving us subject to a suffix, to a doubt as to what he meant, and because of that suffix, he ends up being worse off than it's certainly going to be the case. We're going to see how, in our Mishnah is also a good example, how sometimes we have a case where when a person says something and he leaves us in doubt and becomes a Nazir misafek, the suffix makes us put him into Nazirus for a much more significant amount of time than he had he actually specified what he meant. In our Mishnah, we had a clear case. A guy says something, you ask him, what did you mean? So if he explains to us what he means, so we say, all right, be a Nazir for 30 days. If he doesn't explain to us what he means, then ultimately we end up making him go through a repetitive cycle of being a Nazir. And here's where we have a case. Hareni Nazir, a person says, I'm becoming a Nazir, Almanas, on condition, Shihei Bekrizeh, that there is in this pile Mea Kor. So he says, I'm going to become a Nazir if in this pile of, let's say, grain, there is 100 kor, which is the measure. Now what happens? He goes out with his buddy to go measure that pile of grain. V'halach umatzo shenignav o she'avad. Somebody quickly came by and snatched it. Now he's stuck. He can't count it. He has no idea if there was 100 kor in there. In other words, the item that we're discussing is not a theoretical item. It's an item which exists. It's countable. It's just lost. We can't find it. Now the halach is Reb Shimon Oser. Reb Shimon says it's Aser, which means he ends up becoming an Aser. Why? Shesafik Nazir is lahachmir. We have a suffix here. If there's 100 kor in that pile, he's a Nazir. If there isn't 100 kor in that pile, he's not a Nazir. Says Reb Shimon, we're going to be machmir. And ultimately he becomes a Nazir because maybe there was 100 kor in that pile. Rabbi Yehuda Matir, Rabbi Yehuda is Mekel. He says, no Nazirus here. Why is the suffix Nazirus lahakel? He says the opposite. We have a suffix Nazirus. We're going to be Mekel. So now it seems like we have a very clear machlokis whether we're going to be more machmir misafek than mivadai. And the Gemara wants to suggest the reason why we're going to assume that we're talking about a box filled with mustard seeds is because we're going like Reb Shimon. And Reb Shimon says that in a case where we're in doubt about Naziris, we're going to be machmir. We're going to be strict. We're going to tell him he has to actually accept the Naziris, even though we don't know for certain that he should become a Nazir. Now, just to point out, it's not always so pashut that you're really being machmir by turning him into a Nazir. The reason for this, and I don't want to get into the whole discussion, but ultimately, a Nazir not only has to observe the period of Naziris, when he's done, he has to bring karbanos. So now the 3 karbanos that he brings, out of the 3 of them, 2 of them could just be brought as a regular karban. But there's a chatas as well. A chatas can only come if there's actually something there. You can't bring a chatas nedava. A person can't say, you know what, I'm in such a good mood today, I'm going to bring in a chatas nedava to the base of Mikdash. It doesn't work that way. It's chulin le'azara. So therefore, this idea of Safik Naziris actually comes along with it, with an issue of, if you're going to tell him that he is a Nazir, it comes along with a little bit of a kula that we're allowing him to bring those karbanos, which is a discussion for another time. The Ran addresses this in Maseches Nedarim. Could be we talked about it back then in Maseches Nedarim, but ultimately, it's again the permissibility of someone bringing in a karban chatas on a Safek Naziris is questionable at least. Now, interestingly enough, we'll continue just in a minute, but Tosfos actually points out over here something very interesting. He says, why do we have to say that the box was filled with cucumbers or melons? Why don't we say the box was filled with dough? Now, dough, it all sticks together. It's even one. And Tosfos says, indeed, we could have said that as well. And then Tosfos continues in the Dibur Maskal V'Lechsei. He says that there seems to be a lot of confusion here, and he brings another Gemara in Maseches Tyrus, which, again, which seems to say that we're always going to be machmer when it comes to Naziris. So there's confusion as to whether we're machmer Safek Naziris or not. So Tosfos says in Maseches Tyrus it says we're mekel, but also there are it really all depends on the case. The case that he brings is Heik Nekel Emi Safek. Hold on a second. Le'el Gabi Mikan V'ad Sofa Olam. We mentioned this earlier. When a person says from here until the end of the world, we ask the question the opposite, that he should be a Nazir forever. And the Gemara answered whatever it answered. Now Tosfos says we don't have a hard rule that we're machmir or mekel. It just depends what he said. It's just very difficult to be able to come up with a understanding of what he meant when he said mikan v'ad sofa olam to mean something which is a short period of time. From here till the end of the world always means a very, very long time or an infinite number of possibilities. So in that case, we would be machmir. In our case, we're talking about a full box. A full box can be interpreted any way you want. It can be filled with dough. It can be filled with mustard seeds. So therefore, the Gemara is basically just saying, why in the world did you choose one over the other? Now the Gemara continues. The Gemara wants it to say it's going to be a suffix. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Filu Tamer Rabbi Yehuda. It's possible that our Mishnah that says that we're going to be machmir and say his Naziris is like mustard seeds could even go according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because Hassam, lo nachas lei l'Naziris. He never became a Nazir in the first place. Hacha nachas lei l'Naziris. And what are we discussing? The mai l'sluke mine. We're talking about him leaving his Naziris. So amai lai lechsi kupa ki'ilu meleya. Sorry. Amai lai. In other words, the bottom line is, says Rabbi Yochanan, that these cases are not comparable. In that previous case, in the case of the Gemara where Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda have a machlokes, it's talking about a guy who's not a Nazir. Now, he said, I'll become a Nazir if there are 100 kor there. Says Rabbi Yehuda, he's not a Nazir today. We have no reason to turn him into a Nazir misafek. In our case, he is a Nazir. He wants to stop being a Nazir. He wants to say, I want to be a Nazir for a shorter period of time. So you want to stop being a Nazir, you're already trying to stop whatever the momentum that's going here. You're already a Nazir. Well, it's much more difficult to stop your Nazirus than to stop the Nazirus from being initiated in the first place. But the Gemara says, why not? Let's see the kupa kilu malaya. Let's still look at the box as if it's full with what? Kishuin v'deluin. With melons and cucumbers. Or gourd. V'tavle tekanta. The sakadaitach Nazirus through the kabbalah. Now, just to explain this, the way that the Mefarish explains this is, the bottom line is, the way we're saying this is, he's going to become a Nazir multiple periods of Nazirus, the amount of times compared to the mustard seeds. In other words, let's just say there are 1 million mustard seeds in this box, so he's going to have 1 million periods of 30 days Nazirus. Says the Gemara, every time he finishes his Nazirus, he's starting over again. So the logic is exactly the same. It is the same. It's true that he's a Nazir, but his Nazirus comes to an end. There's a finite amount of days to each Nazirus. So the lumdus works exactly the same, says the Gemara. He starts his Nazirus, and he finishes his Nazirus with the end of the first mustard seed. Now, he wants to start a new Nazirus. So the question is, does he have to start Nazirus all over again compared to the amount of mustard seeds that will fit in the box, or start a new Nazirus compared to the amount of melons that can fit into the box? It's the same thing as saying, does he have to start a Nazirus period based on the fact that there's 100 corn in the box? So that's how the Mefarish explains that even though he is a Nazir, it's completely irrelevant, because that Nazirus certainly comes to an end. Each period of Nazirus is finite. Does that make sense? So that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question is, why still will we not say that the Nazirus should be compared to the more lenient amount, which is going to be a melon or a gourd or something else larger than a mustard seed? The Gemara answers on top of Chesam and Beis, Rabbi Yehuda Savar la Rebbe. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rebbe. We're forgetting about Rebbe in our Mishnah. Rebbe in our Mishnah tells us that we don't have this multiple period of Nazirus. When a person uses this infinite language, what happens is he becomes a Nazir forever. So if a guy's going to be a Nazir like the amount of mustard seeds that fit in the box, it's not mustard seed periods of 30 days. It's just an infinite amount of Nazirus. So it doesn't start and stop and start and stop and start and stop 1 million times. It's just an infinite amount of Nazirus that happens. The Tanan, now how do we know the Yehuda holds like Rebbe? The Tanan, Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says, and we're going to quote Rebbe from our Mishnah. Ein zeh megaleach achas l'soshim yom. This is not a case where a person can take a haircut once every 30 days. Ve'ezahu shemegaleach achas l'soshim yom. Who indeed is the person who can take a haircut every 30 days? That is ha'omer harei alai naziros kesaroshi u'kafar os k'chalayam. When a person clearly uses plural language when he says the word Nazirus. In other words, that's the opinion of Rebbe. The problem is, hold on a second, says the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda misavar like Rebbe. Does Rabbi Yehuda actually hold like Rebbe? V'tanan, have we not learned in the Mishnah, Harini Nazir kiminyan imosachama? A person says, I want to be a Nazir like the amount of days of the solar year. Rabbi Yehuda ma'isa haya v'kivan shehishlim mace. That was our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, as a guy who accepted upon himself Nazirus like the amount of days of the year, then the halacha is, we explained in our Mishnah, he needs to be a Nazir for 30 plus years. Why? Because he has 365 30-day periods. Now, Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah brought in a story after that statement. What was his statement? His statement was that a person actually had to observe this, and when he finished his Nazirus, he died. Now, if you're going to say, like we're saying, not like Rabbi, everything will be good, which is Naziros kamekabel aleh, he accepted upon himself multiple Naziros, hainu taima dekiva dehishla mace. That's actually the reason why when the guy finished, he died. Why? Because it's 365 30-day periods. So that's why the guy actually finished it and died. If you're going to say, Chad Naziris Kibbal Eleve. It's one long Naziris like Rabbi. In other words, it's not 365 30-day periods. Rather, it's one long Naziris. Then, Mihavi, Hashlama, Klal. Would that be a Hashlama? So now on this line, not clear what it means. I'll present to you what I think are the two easiest ways of understanding it. The Mefarish says that according to Rabbi, it would come out that he has 365 days. In other words, you'd have to be a Nazir for 365 years. Now, the problem with that is that in the days of Rabbi Yehuda, as far as we're concerned, people did not live for 365 years. So, in other words, the way Rashi the Mefarish understands Rebbe would hold that he needs to be a Nazir for 365 day periods. That would mean 365 years. And therefore, miyavi hashlama klal, in other words, is it possible for anybody to ever come to the conclusion of this Naziris? That Rabbi Yehuda could say, I saw somebody live that long, and then ultimately when he finally finished this 365-year Naziris, he died. People don't last that long. That's the way the Mefarish explains it. Tosfos doesn't seem to understand it that way, but he seems to understand that according to Rebbe, it would be that he has one long period of Nazirus, but the issue with that is much more of a language issue. In other words, Hashlama, if you look at Tosfos, he says, Ve'ein shaykh bo lashon hashlama klal. It's the fifth line, the fifth skinny line in Tosfos. In other words, according to Tosfos, it's not a problem of it being impossible. It's a problem just that the language of hashlama, finishing, doesn't seem to be the right language to use when a person finishes just one period of Nazirus. So either way, the fact just is that the Rosh says that when you bring a story in a Mishnah, it's always brought there to support the narrative that was just said. In other words, it's always going to be a corroborating story. If the Mishnah says something, you're not going to bring something called a Maisa Listar, a story to actually go ahead and contradict what you just said. Now, if you're going to hold like Rebbe, then either the case of Kamini Nemosachama has to be 365 years, which is impossible for a human being, or it just doesn't, the language of Hashlama, of completing, doesn't fit someone who just basically serves out one period of Nazirus. So therefore, we have a problem saying that Rabbi Yehuda of the Mishnah we mentioned previously actually goes according to Rabbi, because Rabbi Yehuda actually brings this supportive narrative to the Mishnah, which would only fit with the other opinion, the Tanakama of our Mishnah, which is similar to Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara goes on, Rabbi. Another reason why he can't hold like Rabbi. Vatanya, we have a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says, Hareini Nazir, I'm going to be a Nazir, which is minyan hilkati kayetz. The amount of, basically it's the fig harvest. Kayetz means, it usually means summer. In this case, it refers to the gathering of the figs, which happen to be harvested in the summer as well. Or he says, Nazir uminyan shibali shmita, the amount of shmita stalks. What's the halacha? Mona nazirus kaminyan hilkati kayetz ukaminyan shibali shmita. He counts out those figs that are there, or the stalks of shmita. Now, clearly, what are we seeing over here? That he counts it out. You could just look at the Mefarish, which is 4 lines up before it starts to get wide. Kolomar kol yamav yehemona nazirus shalamid umigaleach maybe carbon. In other words, he keeps doing periods of nazirus for the amount of times compared to all those things that he found. So again, this doesn't fit with Rebbe, because Rebbe doesn't hold with this idea of the nazirus lasting a bunch of 30-day periods. According to Rebbe, it's one long period of Nazirus. So why is he counting all these different times? According to Rebbe, that doesn't work. So the Gemara says, Minyan shani. When you use the term minyan, that's going to be different. In other words, when you use the term minyan, which describes a quantifiable amount, that actually says that there's going to be a number of different periods. More says, but it's not true. Hold on a second. Mishani is actually true. Mishani leil Rabbi minyan. Does the term minyan, in other words, the term multitude, does it actually make a difference? Vatanya, we've learned in the Brisa, Harini Nazir Kiminyan Yemosachama. I'm going to be a Nazir, singular, Kiminyan. You adding that word minyan, which refers to a multitude, a quantity. Yemosachama, like the days of the solar calendar. Mona Nazir is Kiminyan Yemosachama. Kimei Halavana. Sorry, he counts the amount of days of the Mosachama, Kimei Halavana. If he specifies the amount of the lunar calendar, Moni Kimei Halavana. And Rabbi says, no, Ad Sheyomer Naziros Alai Kiminyan Yemosachama or Kiminyan Yemosalavana. So again, very clearly, Rabbi still argues when you use the language of minyan. Rabbi says you have to have a plural language in the word Nazirus. In other words, according to Rabbi, if you're going to say Aryeh Nazir and then say Kiminyan Yemosachama, you are one Nazir period forever. Or not forever. For the amount of time of the year. For 365 days. Only when you say Naziros, then you get into the category of multiple 30-day periods. So clearly, adding the word minyan does not help. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Sarvala Kavasei Bechada, Upala Galei Bechada. In other words, we got stuck in this because in Rabbi Yehuda, we're trying to figure out why is he going to be machmir on this Nazirus period, but we still find that he doesn't really, in other places, he doesn't go along with Rebbe. So the Gemara says he's not obligated to agree with Rebbe in everything that Rebbe says. So therefore, he agrees with him in one thing, but he disagrees with him in another area. The Gemara explains. Savar Kavasei B'chada, he agrees with him in one thing, which is that Chada Nazirus Kibol Ilave. He agrees, if you add in the word Chada over there, then it reads much better, that when a person speaks this way, he accepts upon himself one long Nazirus. Upala Galeh B'chada, he actually disagrees with him in one area, which is Ilu Rabbi Yehuda Shani Le Moneh. Rebbe Lo Shani Le Moneh. In other words, it's true that Rebbe himself does not distinguish between whether he adds in the word, which clearly indicates that there's a quantity here, or not. So Rabbi Yehuda says, if you say minyan, then yes, it does allow you to break up your Nazirus into multiple different periods. But if you say Nazir, then, says Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to be just like Rebbe, where it's one long period of Nazirus. The Gemara continues. Tan Rabbanan. Hareini Nazir, person says he's going to be a Nazir, kol yimei chayai, the entire length of my life. Or Hareini Nazir Olam, I'm going to be a Nazir forever. The halach is Harei Zeh Nazir Olam. This person ends up being a Nazir forever. But if he says Afilu Meyashana, he adds in that additional expression of even for 100 years, or Afilu Elef Shana, even 1,000 years, Ein Zeh Nazir Olam. He's not a Nazir Olam, Ela Nazir Li'olam. He becomes a Nazir Li'olam. We differentiated already previously. The Nazir Olam is like Avshalom. He's able to take a haircut. We spend time at Shabbos determining whether that's every 12 months, whether it's every month, every week. But ultimately, he has the ability to take a haircut when his hair gets too heavy. But a Nazir Le'olam is stuck forever. So if he says Afilu Me'ashanim, even 100 years, even 1,000 years, that's the expression that turns him into a Nazir basically forever. Gemara continues. Hareini Nazir, person Tan Rabbanan. Hareini Nazir, person says I want to be a Nazir. I'm going to become a Nazir. Ve'achas, and one. So then it's Nazir plus one. Moneshtayim. It becomes a Nazir for 2 periods of time, 230-day Naziruses. He adds in the word ve'od, so he says Hareini Nazir ve'achas ve'od. Then Moneshalosh. He has 3 periods of Nazirus. Now he adds in the word v'shuv, so he says Hareini Nazir ve'achas ve'od v'shuv. So v'shuv adds on another one. Then Allah is Mon Arba, he has to count 4 30-day periods of Nazirus. So Gemara says, Pshita. Of course. In other words, at a certain point, this comes obvious. And the truth is, the Rosh says, the question of Pshita really goes on the Va'od as well. In other words, once we said, Harini Nazir Va'achas means plus one, so saying, and another one also is obvious. And then saying, Vishuv is also obvious. The Gemara says, Ma'udutemo Vishuv, Ki Kulu, V'havele Shis, Kamash Mondalo. I would think Vishuv, and the truth is even Va'od, really means I'm doubling what I have. Vishuv means, so he says, Harini Nazir, V'achas, V'od, so you got three. Vishuv, and do it again. So Vishuv is going to be a fourth, or does it say Vishuv, repeat the whole process and make me into six? So you would think it turns him into six. No, we allow him to have only four. Kamash Malan, this teaches us that no, Vishuv just adds on one more period. Now, Tan Rabbanan, Haredi Nazir, person says I'm going to become a Nazir. Sumchas Omer, Sumchas says, Hain, he adds on the word Hain, then that's one. Digun, Shtayim. He says the word Digun, which is Greek, then he's two. Trigun, Shalosh. If he says Tartagon, Arba. What's the next word? Pentagon. That's where the word comes from. Pentagon. It's a Greek word. Pantigon. That might be where it's located. But again, pentagon we know, which is a five-sided shape. So Pantigon, pentagon, is Chamesh. He becomes a Nazir for 5 periods of time. What's the Chiddush in this whole thing? In other words, he's basically counting in Greek. So actually, the Mefarshim explain, the Chiddush is that even though he didn't speak in Lashon Kodesh, a person could be Mekabel Nazirus in any language that he wants. The Mefarsh says this very clearly. V'ashmi'inan, it's 5 lines up from the bottom. V'ashmi'inan, t'b'chol lashon, yachal adam l'kabel alav Nazirus, he could accept upon Nazirus in any language that he wants. So if he happens to be a Greek speaker, and that's how he counts, then he says Nazirus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then yes, he accepts 5 periods of Nazirus. Now, once we mentioned Greek numbers over here, Gemara finishes off, Tan Rabbanan. Bayis Agol, a house that is round, or Digun, a house that has only 2 walls. Trigun has only 3 walls. I guess tri would be 3 walls. Puntigon, skipping 4, and a house that has 5 walls. Halacha is Einu metame negoyim, cannot become tame from tumas negoyim. But if it's tatragon, if it's going to have 4 walls, then metame b'negoyim, then it does indeed become tame with tumas negoyim. My time, what's the reason for that? Lamatu Omer, later on, a subsequent pasuk it says kir and kiros. Uses the word kir and kiros. And lamalahu Omer, kir and kiros. In an earlier pasuk it says kir and kiros. Harekan arba. In other words, we have kir, kiros. That teaches us that in order for a house to become tamei with tumas negoyim, it has to have 4 walls. So that is, again, another limud which has nothing to do with Maseches Nazir, but once we got into these Greek numbers, we're going to bring in this relevant brisa about counting the amount of walls that a house has. Hadron alach kol kinuye. Mirz Hashem, we should be able to finish Maseches Nazir together. Have a wonderful day. For Yehuda Walter, 65